So first, I'd like to start off by asking, when you picture your favorite horror movie, what do you typically picture? What do you enjoy about it? I'm assuming a majority of you will not end up saying the amount of work that goes into the scares to make it effective. Usually, whenever we pick a horror movie to watch, it ends up getting denounced as just dumb fun. And while it is true that watching dumb characters make dumb decisions, being chased by dumb generic killers at a dumb summer camp can be a lot of dumb fun, there's a lot more to it than just that. There's a lot of work that goes into the production of it. Typically, making horror work is a hard task, as the principle behind it is never constant, and fear as a factor is completely random. In fact, what one person might find scary, another person might end up actually finding funny. But why is this? If it is so important if horror is so effective, then how can we never take time to sit back and actually think about those who are not only able to master it, but also turn it into a form of art? How come all the time, big name award ceremonies, general public, and big media tend to ignore it, if it does deserve the respect it needs and it is tricky to craft? I think this is a great question and one that is really tricky to answer. Could it be because of poor ratings? Could it be because of the dark nature of the genre? Or maybe people are just scared and say that it is gratuitous, gory shock value, which in some cases it might just be. I personally think at its core that the response of fear comes from the idea that fear usually comes from the brain. It's the release of adrenaline in a part of the brain called the amygdala, or the amygdala. Fun fact, I only learned how to pronounce this recently from a horror game in itself called Bloodborne, because one of the creatures in it is referred to as amygdala throughout the entire talk. In that part of the brain, it's the emotional response core. It releases dopamine, the main ingredient in happiness. It also releases adrenaline, the main component in fear. Adrenaline is what causes your heart to beat at 1,000 miles per hour. It's what builds that tension before a jump scare happens on the screen. It's also what allows horror to stay in your mind so long after the screen goes dark. It's what has that lasting effect on you. Also, because they get released at the same time from the same place, they kind of combine in a weird way. That's what creates the phenomenon known as fight or flight. During fight or flight, you're so pumped up on adrenaline, and you're also bizarrely happy that you think you can do whatever you want to do. And usually you can. This acts as a great motivator, and is a big part of why horror is so beneficial for people, why fear has so many positives rather than negatives in the end, and why people are able to grow from such a scary experience. Now that I've talked about why fear is important, and why I genuinely enjoy horror, I want to go back to the idea that it doesn't get the credibility it properly deserves. To do that, I want to talk about my favorite aspect of it, and that's the general practicality of the craft. A lot of time, horror directors seem to focus more on the idea of practical effects over digital computer-created effects. This takes up a lot more time, effort, and money. And the issue with that is that once you do all that, and you try to get the shot, and let's say it goes wrong, then you need to set it all up again. It's such a stressful job, but it's created a lot of really talented people in the past, as people have a big passion for this. In fact, my favorite story from the blood elevator scene, one of the most iconic horror scenes ever, from The Shining, the director, Stanley Kubrick, had to leave set before they filmed it. He went to go get a drink because he couldn't be there when they filmed it, just in case they messed up. He came back and they told him, yeah, it went well. And it created one of the most iconic shots ever. It's also given name to a lot of really important people that I feel like I need to highlight, such as Heather Langenkamp. She was an actress in the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, but then later on in life decided to work with her husband on big horror movies during the general production of it. She worked on probably one of my favorite films, Cabin in the Woods, when it comes to special effects, just because of the pure scale of that movie. There's also Tom Savini, the man behind the zombies and all of George A. Romero's Of the Dead franchise. And then Phil Tippett, who I want to get to in a second, because you will recognize his work, but you don't recognize the man. All these people contribute so much to the movies they work on, and yet they're sidelined in the end. People focus on the directors, people focus on the actors. You don't really go, oh, I like that digital effects artist, or I like that special effects artist. But imagine if George A. Romero hired a different guy for making the zombies. The interpretation of it would be completely different. It would be entirely different. Now on to Phil Tepper. Once again, I said, you'll recognize his work, you won't recognize the man. He's responsible for creating all of our favorite creatures from Star Wars. He made the AT-ATs, he did the puppetry for everyone's favorite character, Jabba the Hutt. And he also just happened to make, recently, a film called Mad God. This is his passion project. This took him 30 years to make, is entirely stop motion, and the only reason he made it was to prove to himself that stop motion in horror is a craft that should be explored, that should be enjoyed often, that there's so much more to it than just gratuitous gory shock value. But the thing with it is that because he worked on Star Wars, that's all he's remembered for. He's just the Star Wars guy now. No one's going to remember him for this. That's what's usually typically because of the popularity of the franchise. Which, if I had life work and people remember me for something smaller that I did back when I was younger, I'd want to cry. Usually, and I get it, I get why people would prefer Star Wars over this, because looking at the AT-ATs, that imagery, it's a lot easier to digest. It's a lot easier to look at. When it comes to a film like Mad God, it's really impossible to explain some of the imagery he incorporates in this movie. It's intense and it's weird, and I get it, because what is it? It feels like a bad acid trip half the time. But still, it's important, because what this has that AT-ATs don't have is story, general knowledge, importance, meaning behind it. The entire craft of this movie serves a purpose to tell a story. AT-ATs are just a vehicle used in Star Wars to drive the plot forward. This is the story itself, which is what horror does the best. It's able to incorporate symbolism. It's able to use simple story-building techniques in order to create something that you can connect to, when usually this is far from anything you can connect to. Not usually. Going back to him, as mentioned earlier, his whole purpose exists as like a demigod in his respective IP. He lived past all of humanity's hardships, and he's still alive and he's still worshipped. But the thing is, when you try to connect his name to the part of the brain, you realize all he does is represent fear. He represents human emotion. And all of a sudden, with just a simple name, as simple as Amidala, can't pronounce it still, it creates a connection. This otherworldly being that you would not be able to relate to, all of a sudden feels weirdly human. Its struggles it went through, if you were to go through the game, makes sense. And the fact that it's worshipped says a lot about its creature, about its story, about the world it's in, about us. And that's what's so important about horror, is that oftentimes the stories explore us the most. It's about our own personal struggles, our own personal desires, our own personal wants. It conveys that in the form of monsters so that you can confront that and come out stronger on the other side. Similar to how adrenaline works with fear, similar to how fight or flight is. To finish this off, to really work on the point, I want to talk about one of my favorite horror franchises of all time, Silent Hill. One of the greatest things I've ever experienced, and I could easily do my entire talk on this if I wanted to. Each one of these games fits every point I mentioned prior, plus more. In fact, I can talk about completely random stuff about this, and it would still connect. But I don't have the time for that, so I'm just going to focus on the second installment, Silent Hill 2. This game focuses heavily on the ideas of guilt. The world is isolated, it's cold, it's metallic, and it's bitter. It's scary, and it's lonely. Oftentimes, the idea of guilt is present in almost every aspect of it, through the characters, through the world, through the monsters, through the interactions, and even at times through the music. And you may be wondering why I'm bringing up Silent Hill. This is the personal part. I'm talking about like it personally. I was in middle school when I played this. I don't know how I'm supposed to relate to guilt, and I didn't for the longest time, until I got to the end of the game, when the idea of it started to make a lot more sense. Remember how I said that the idea of guilt is present through the music? What that means is that it's very technical, industrial. A lot of the time, the music incorporates like construction noises, and that's it. That's all it does to convey this feeling of being void of life. It's supposed to be lonely, it's supposed to be isolated. And it keeps that up throughout the entire game, until the very end, during the main climax, when the main character comes to the realization of his own guilt, and he drops to his knees. That same song, called Betrayal, by Akira Yamaoka, starts playing. But once he comes to that realization, it switches. A low hum comes into play, a low melody, a very calming and relaxing melody. it contrasts, it doesn't make sense, it shouldn't go with the industrial thumping that you were just hearing, but it does. It's weirdly calming, it's weirdly inspiring in a way, honestly. But it's important, because it marks a pivotal point in the story, in the idea of guilt. It shows the inner conflict this character is having. It symbolizes the idea that no matter what you do, no matter what you've done, in the end, you're still human. There's still something going on. And I think that's something I really needed to hear, the acceptance aspect of that. So even though I don't agree with the idea of guilt, it's still powerful to me. I'd like to wrap this up really quickly by saying that I believe the reason why horror is ignored most of the time is because, big name award ceremonies can't understand the personal aspect of it. They don't get it. They really don't. Horror is taken from yourself. It's taken as your being. It's your conflicts coming out, struggling. And that's how you confront it. And that's what makes it so impactful, and that's what makes it so effective. And that's why I agree, I believe that if you ever watch a horror movie again, anytime soon, go out and simply try to pay attention just a little bit more and give your own meaning to madness. There's Ryan Gosling again. Thank you.